The ancient stone corridors of Valdoria Castle echoed with hurried footsteps as Prince Alexander rushed toward the royal chambers. The urgent message from his personal guard had been cryptic but alarming. "Your Highness must come immediately to the Queen Mother's quarters. There is a situation requiring your immediate attention." Alexander's mind raced as he navigated the familiar hallways of his childhood home. The castle had been unusually tense lately, ever since his stepmother, Lady Victoria, had been granted access to the royal archives and personal effects. His father, King Edmund, had married Victoria just 2 years after the tragic death of Alexander's beloved mother, Queen Isabella. The marriage had been politically motivated, designed to strengthen ties with the neighboring kingdom of Astoria, but it had never sat well with Alexander or his younger sister, Princess Sophia. As he approached the ornate double doors leading to what had once been his mother's private chambers, Alexander could hear raised voices from within. His blood ran cold when he recognized the sharp, commanding tone of Lady Victoria cutting through the air like a blade. What was she doing in those sacred rooms? The guard who had summoned him, Captain Marcus, stood at attention beside the doors. His weathered face was grave, and there was something in his eyes that Alexander had never seen before. A mixture of anger and disgust that made the prince's stomach clench with dread. "What's happening in there, Marcus?" Alexander demanded, keeping his voice low but urgent. "Your Highness," Marcus began, his voice strained with emotion, "Lady Victoria has been going through Queen Isabella's personal belongings. When we discovered what she was doing," he paused, struggling to find the right words. "Sir, you need to see this for yourself." Without another word, Alexander pushed open the heavy doors and stepped into the chamber that had been sealed since his mother's death 5 years ago. The sight that greeted him was like a physical blow to his chest. The room, once pristine and carefully preserved as a memorial to Queen Isabella, was in complete disarray. Jewelry boxes lay overturned on the marble floor, their precious contents scattered like fallen stars across the Persian rugs. Portraits had been pulled from the walls and stacked haphazardly against furniture. But what made Alexander's blood boil was the sight of Lady Victoria standing in the center of the room, holding something that made his heart stop. In her manicured hands was his mother's wedding dress, the same ethereal gown of ivory silk and Belgian lace that had graced countless royal portraits and had been the stuff of fairy tales throughout the kingdom. But Victoria wasn't simply holding it. She was examining it with cold, calculating eyes, and in her other hand was a pair of ornate scissors that gleamed menacingly in the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. "What do you think you're doing?" Alexander's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried such force that Victoria startled and nearly dropped the precious garment. Victoria's face, usually a mask of practiced composure, showed a flicker of surprise before quickly resuming its haughty expression. "Alexander, darling," she said with false sweetness, "I was just taking inventory of your mother's things. Your father asked me to organize her belongings. Some of these items could be quite valuable, and the dress, well, it's taking up so much space in the royal collection." "Valuable?" Alexander stepped closer, his dark eyes blazing with a fury that made even the usually unflappable Victoria take a step back. "That dress is priceless because it was my mother's. It's not some commodity to be appraised and sold." Victoria's mask began to slip, revealing the calculating woman beneath. "Oh, please, Alexander. Don't be so sentimental. It's just a dress that's gathering dust. The silk could be repurposed. The lace could be used for something more practical. Your mother is gone, and clinging to these material remnants won't bring her back." The callousness of her words hit Alexander like a physical slap. He had always known that Victoria was ambitious and cold, but he had never imagined she could be so cruel, so utterly lacking in respect for his mother's memory. The dress in her hands represented more than just a wedding gown. It was a symbol of his parents' love story, a piece of history that belonged to the royal family's legacy. "Put it down," Alexander said, his voice deadly quiet. "Put it down right now and step away from my mother's belongings." Victoria's laugh was sharp and bitter.
"Your mother's belongings?"
"Alexander, dear boy, your father is my husband now. Everything in this castle belongs to him, and by extension, to me, including this dress and everything else in this room. She held up the scissors, and for a terrifying moment, Alexander thought she might actually cut into the delicate fabric. Perhaps I should start with the train? It's so ridiculously long, quite impractical, really. Or maybe these sleeves? All this lace is so outdated. Stop this now. The roar came not from Alexander, but from Captain Marcus, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing horror. His shout echoed through the chamber and down the corridors beyond, immediately followed by the sound of multiple sets of boots rushing toward the room. Within seconds, 6 royal guards burst through the doorway, their hands instinctively moving to their sword hilts as they assessed the situation. The lead guard, Sergeant Thomas, had served the royal family for over 20 years and had been particularly devoted to Queen Isabella. When he saw Victoria holding the late queen's wedding dress with scissors poised nearby, his face went white with shock and rage. "Your Highness," Sergeant Thomas addressed Alexander while keeping his eyes fixed on Victoria. "Are you in need of assistance?" The situation had escalated far beyond what he had imagined possible. Victoria's actions weren't just disrespectful, they bordered on desecration. The wedding dress wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was a treasured artifact that belonged in the royal collection, protected and preserved for future generations. His mother had specifically requested in her will that her personal effects be maintained in trust for her children. "Lady Victoria," Alexander said, finding his voice again, "you will place my mother's dress down immediately and leave this room. You have no right to be here, and you certainly have no right to threaten to destroy irreplaceable family heirlooms." Victoria looked around at the assembled guards, realizing for the first time that she might have overplayed her hand, but her pride and ambition wouldn't allow her to back down easily. "I have every right," she insisted, though her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I am the queen now, and this is my domain."
You are not the queen. Alexander corrected her firmly.
"You are the king's wife, but you will never be Queen Isabella's replacement, and you will never have the right to destroy what belongs to this family's heritage." The tension in the room was palpable. The guards stood ready to act on Alexander's command, while Victoria clutched the dress more tightly, the scissors still in her other hand. It was a standoff that could define the future of the royal family's dynamics. Captain Marcus stepped forward carefully. "Lady Victoria, with all due respect, Queen Isabella's personal effects are protected under royal law. They cannot be altered or disposed of without the express consent of her direct heirs, Prince Alexander and Princess Sophia." Victoria's eyes darted between the guards and Alexander, calculating her options. The room fell silent except for the soft whisper of silk as the wedding dress moved slightly in her trembling hands. The standoff in Queen Isabella's chambers stretched into an eternity of tense silence. Victoria's knuckles were white as she gripped the wedding dress, her calculated composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of multiple accusatory stares. The scissors in her other hand caught the light from the tall windows, creating small flashes that seemed to emphasize the gravity of what she had been about to do. Prince Alexander studied his stepmother's face, searching for any sign of the woman his father had fallen in love with. All he saw was ambition masked as entitlement, and a cold calculation that made his skin crawl. This wasn't the first time Victoria had overstepped her bounds since marrying into the royal family, but it was certainly the most egregious. "Thomas," Alexander addressed the lead guard without taking his eyes off Victoria, "please send word to Princess Sophia immediately. She needs to know what's happening here." Victoria's carefully controlled expression flickered with something that might have been panic. Princess Sophia, though younger than Alexander, was known throughout the kingdom for her fierce protection of their mother's memory and her complete intolerance for Victoria's machinations. "That won't be necessary," Victoria said quickly, finally lowering the scissors. "I think there's been a misunderstanding here. I wasn't going to damage the dress. I was simply examining it for preservation purposes." Captain Marcus made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a snort. "Preservation purposes? My lady, you were holding scissors to Queen Isabella's wedding gown while discussing how to repurpose the fabric." The accusation hung in the air like a sword. Victoria's face flushed red, but whether from embarrassment or anger, Alexander couldn't tell. Probably both. I don't have to explain my actions to a common guard, Victoria snapped, her mask of civility finally slipping completely. I am the lady of this castle, and I will not be questioned by servants. This was exactly the wrong thing to say. Captain Marcus had served the royal family with distinction for decades, had fought in wars to protect the kingdom, and had been personally commended by Queen Isabella for his loyalty and service. The insult to his honor was also an insult to Alexander's judgment in keeping him as his personal guard. You will apologize to Captain Marcus immediately, Alexander commanded, his voice carrying the full authority of his royal heritage. He is not a common guard, and he has shown more loyalty to this family than you have demonstrated in 2 years of marriage to my father. Victoria's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. She had clearly not expected Alexander to defend his guard so forcefully, and the public nature of the rebuke was obviously humiliating for someone of her pride. Before she could formulate a response, the sound of rapid footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Princess Sophia burst into the room like a force of nature, her long auburn hair streaming behind her, and her green eyes blazing with fury. At 19, she possessed all the grace and beauty of her mother, but also a temper that could level mountains when properly provoked. What is going on here? Sophia demanded, taking in the chaos of the room with a single sweeping glance. When her eyes fell on Victoria holding their mother's wedding dress, her face went pale with shock before flushing with rage. You, Sophia pointed an accusatory finger at Victoria, step away from our mother's dress right now, or I swear by everything holy that you'll regret it for the rest of your miserable life. Victoria looked desperately around the room, seeking an ally or an escape route. Finding neither, she tried to regain control of the narrative. Sophia, darling, you're overreacting. I was simply taking inventory of your mother's things at your father's request. Some of these items need proper care and attention. Proper care? Sophia's voice rose to a pitch that made everyone wince. Proper care involves preserving them exactly as they are, not threatening them with scissors while discussing their repurposing. Alexander watched as his sister advanced on Victoria like an avenging angel. Sophia had inherited their mother's gentle nature, but she had also inherited their father's protective instincts and their maternal grandfather's strategic mind. When those elements combined with righteous fury, the result was formidable. Sophia, Alexander said quietly, placing a restraining hand on his sister's arm, let me handle this. But Sophia shook him off. No, Alex. I'm tired of handling her with kid gloves while she systematically tries to erase every trace of our mother from this castle. Do you know what else she's done? She had Mother's portrait removed from the main dining hall. She's been reorganizing the library where Mother used to read to us. And now this, the wedding dress that was supposed to be preserved for our children and grandchildren. This was news to Alexander. He had been traveling extensively on royal business and hadn't been aware of the extent of Victoria's activities. The revelation made his anger burn even hotter. Is this true? He demanded of Victoria. Victoria's silence was answer enough. Captain Marcus cleared his throat. Your Highness, if I may speak freely, Lady Victoria has been making inquiries about selling various items from Queen Isabella's collection. She approached several merchants in the capital about evaluating royal artifacts for potential sale or modification. The merchants informed me because they were uncomfortable with the requests. The room erupted in stunned silence. The idea of selling Queen Isabella's personal effects was so shocking, so completely contrary to royal protocol and basic decency, that for a moment no one could speak. Princess Sophia was the first to recover. You were planning to sell our mother's things? Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout could have. Victoria finally seemed to realize the full magnitude of her situation. Surrounded by hostile faces and caught red-handed in what could only be described as a betrayal of the royal family's trust, she attempted one last desperate play. You don't understand the pressures I face, she said, her voice taking on a plaintive quality. I'm trying to modernize this castle, to make it more efficient. Some of these old things are just taking up space and gathering dust. I thought we could honor Isabella's memory in other ways while also being practical about the kingdom's resources. It was a calculated appeal to practicality over sentiment, but it fell completely flat with her audience. Practical? Alexander's voice was dangerously quiet. You think it's practical to destroy irreplaceable pieces of our family's history? To sell artifacts that have been in our family for generations? The wedding dress alone is worth more to our heritage than anything you could possibly get for it from merchants, Sophia added. It's not about money. It's about respect, about preserving the memory of a woman who gave her life to serving this kingdom. Fine, she snapped. If you want to live in a museum dedicated to a dead woman, that's your choice. But don't expect me to pretend that keeping every scrap of fabric and piece of jewelry is somehow noble or necessary. The cruelty of the words hit the room like a physical blow. To refer to Queen Isabella as simply a dead woman while holding her wedding dress was so callous, so deliberately hurtful, that even the guards looked shocked. Alexander felt something cold and final settle in his chest. Any possibility of reconciliation with his stepmother had just evaporated. This wasn't about different perspectives on preservation versus practicality. This was about fundamental respect for his mother's memory and the family's heritage. "Put the dress down," he said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Put it down now and leave this room immediately." Victoria looked at the dress in her hands, then at the scissors, and for a terrifying moment Alexander thought she might actually cut it out of spite. The tension in the room reached a breaking point as everyone held their breath, waiting to see what she would do. The moment stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Victoria's eyes flickered between the wedding dress in her hands, the scissors she still held, and the faces of everyone surrounding her. The rational part of her mind must have realized that damaging Queen Isabella's dress would be an unforgivable act that would permanently destroy any remaining goodwill between her and the royal family. But the cornered, desperate part of her seemed to be weighing exactly that option. Princess Sophia took a careful step forward, her hands extended in a gesture that was both pleading and warning. "Victoria, please, whatever issues you have with us, whatever you're trying to accomplish, don't take it out on the dress. It represents something pure and beautiful that has nothing to do with politics or power struggles." For just a moment, Victoria's expression softened, and Alexander glimpsed something almost human in her eyes, perhaps regret or recognition of how far she had fallen from grace. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by a hardness that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within her soul. "Pure and beautiful?" Victoria laughed bitterly. "Do you children have any idea what your precious mother's pure and beautiful marriage actually cost this kingdom? The treaties that had to be renegotiated, the alliances that were strained, the economic policies that had to be restructured to accommodate her idealistic notions about ruling with compassion instead of strength. Victoria was suggesting things about his parents' marriage and his mother's reign that contradicted everything he had been told, everything he believed about his family's history. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. Victoria seemed to realize she had revealed more than she intended, but now that the words were out, she pressed forward with reckless abandon. "Your mother was beloved by the people, yes, but she was a disaster for international relations. Her insistence on humanitarian policies over strategic interests weakened our position with neighboring kingdoms. Your father has spent the last 5 years repairing the damage." "That's not true," Sophia said fiercely. "Mother brought peace and prosperity to our kingdom. She negotiated trade agreements that benefited everyone, not just the nobility." "Trade agreements that left us vulnerable," Victoria shot back. "Humanitarian policies that drained the treasury. Diplomatic approaches that were seen as weakness by our enemies. Your father married me specifically because my family's connections could restore the strategic partnerships your mother's idealism had damaged." The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. If Victoria was telling the truth, and given her current state of desperation, she had little reason to lie about something so easily verified, then his understanding of recent history was fundamentally flawed. But even if that were the case, it didn't justify what she was doing now. Captain Marcus stepped forward slightly. "Lady Victoria, with respect, Queen Isabella's political legacy is not relevant to the current situation. You are holding irreplaceable family heirlooms while threatening to damage them. Whatever political discussions need to happen can happen later, in appropriate venues." Victoria turned on him with renewed fury. "Don't you dare lecture me about what's relevant. I've spent 2 years living in the shadow of a dead woman while trying to help this kingdom recover from her mistakes. Every room I enter is a shrine to Isabella. Every policy I suggest is compared to what she would have done. Every dress I wear is criticized because it's not as elegant as something she owned. The raw emotion in Victoria's voice was startling. Beneath the calculation and ambition, Alexander realized, was a woman who felt trapped and diminished by constant comparison to his mother's memory. It didn't excuse her actions, but it explained them in a way that made the situation even more tragic. "Victoria," he said carefully, "if that's how you feel, then we should have talked about it. We could have found ways to help you establish your own identity as my father's wife without erasing mother's memory." "Talked about it?" Victoria's laugh was hollow. "When? Every conversation we've had since my marriage has been about preserving Isabella's legacy, maintaining Isabella's traditions, honoring Isabella's wishes. There's been no room for Victoria's ideas or Victoria's vision for this kingdom's future." Princess Sophia's expression had shifted from pure anger to something more complex, a mixture of understanding and continued outrage. "Even if all of that is true," she said slowly, "destroying our mother's belongings isn't the answer. It's cruel and destructive and accomplishes nothing positive." Victoria looked down at the wedding dress still clutched in her hands, as if seeing it clearly for the first time. The delicate ivory silk seemed to glow in the afternoon light, and the intricate lacework created patterns that spoke of countless hours of meticulous craftsmanship. It was, objectively, a work of art that transcended personal or political conflicts. "I wasn't going to destroy it," she said quietly, her voice lacking its earlier venom. I thought if I could modify it, make it into something new, it might become a symbol of moving forward instead of looking backward." "But it's not yours to modify," Alexander pointed out gently. "It belongs to our family's history. It's part of a story that's already been written and shouldn't be changed." Victoria's shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time since entering the room, she looked like a woman rather than an adversary. "I've been so tired," she admitted. "Tired of living up to impossible standards, tired of being the villain in everyone's story, tired of feeling like an intruder in my own home." The admission created a moment of unexpected empathy in the room. Even the guards seemed to relax slightly, sensing that the immediate crisis was passing. Sergeant Thomas stepped forward respectfully. "Lady Victoria, perhaps we could help you find appropriate ways to establish your own traditions and legacy. The kingdom is large enough for multiple royal legacies to coexist." Victoria looked at him with surprise, clearly not expecting understanding from that quarter. "Do you really think that's possible? After everything that's happened today?" Alexander exchanged glances with his sister. Sophia's expression was still guarded, but he could see her natural compassion beginning to override her anger. They were both young enough to remember what it felt like to be overwhelmed by expectations and responsibilities they hadn't chosen. "It might be possible," Alexander said carefully, "but it would require mutual respect and clear boundaries. You can't try to erase our mother's memory in order to establish your own legacy. And we can't expect you to live exactly like she did," Sophia added reluctantly. "You're a different person with different strengths and different ideas. There should be room for both approaches." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion she had shown since the confrontation began. Slowly, carefully, she extended the wedding dress toward Alexander. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for things to go this far." Alexander took the dress from her hands with the reverence due to a sacred relic. The silk was cool and smooth, unmarked by the day's drama. As he held it, he could almost feel the presence of his mother, and with it came an unexpected surge of understanding for everyone involved in the situation. "We're all sorry," he said quietly. "We've all handled this badly." Captain Marcus began directing the other guards to help restore order to the room, while Sophia moved to embrace Victoria in a gesture that surprised everyone, including Victoria herself.
"We need to do better," Sophia said softly.
"All of us." Victoria nodded, unable to speak through her tears. But even as the immediate crisis seemed to be resolving, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that deeper problems remained. The political revelations Victoria had made about his mother's reign needed to be investigated. The underlying tensions between preserving tradition and embracing change would need to be addressed, and most importantly, they would need to find a way to help Victoria establish her own identity and legacy without destroying what came before. The wedding dress, safely returned to Alexander's care, seemed to represent all of these challenges. It was a beautiful artifact from the past, but it existed in the present, where real people were struggling with real problems that had no simple solutions. As the immediate tension in Queen Isabella's chambers began to dissipate, Alexander carefully laid his mother's wedding dress across the ornate chaise lounge where she used to sit while reading. The sight of the pristine gown against the familiar furniture created a poignant reminder of happier times, but it also highlighted the complex challenges facing the royal family. Victoria sat heavily in one of the gilded chairs, her earlier bravado completely deflated. The tears that had started when she apologized continued to flow silently down her cheeks, leaving tracks through her carefully applied makeup. For the first time since entering the family, she looked genuinely vulnerable rather than calculating. Princess Sophia, despite her earlier fury, had positioned herself near Victoria in what Alexander recognized as his sister's instinctive protective response. Even when angry, Sophia couldn't ignore someone in genuine distress, a quality she had inherited directly from their mother. Victoria, Alexander began carefully, we need to understand what's really been happening. If what you said about Mother's policies is true, then there are conversations this family should have had years ago. Victoria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of mascara that made her look younger and more fragile. Your father never wanted you children to know about the problems Isabella's reign created. He thought it would tarnish your memories of her. Captain Marcus and Sergeant Thomas exchanged meaningful glances. As senior members of the Royal Guard, they would have been privy to political discussions that the royal children were shielded from. Their expressions suggested that Victoria's claims contained at least some truth. Marcus, Alexander addressed his captain directly. Is what she's saying accurate? Captain Marcus straightened, clearly uncomfortable with being asked to comment on royal policy decisions. Your Highness, it's not my place to critique the late Queen's policies. But there were challenges. International negotiations became more difficult after some of her humanitarian initiatives. Several kingdoms viewed our approaches as naive. Sophia sank into a chair across from Victoria, her world clearly shaking as much as Alexander's. But the people loved her. The kingdom prospered under her rule. Internally, yes, Victoria said quietly, her voice still thick with tears. Isabella was genuinely beloved by your citizens, and domestic policy was largely successful. But international relations, that was a different story. When your father married me, it wasn't just for love. My family's connections to the Eastern kingdoms were essential for rebuilding alliances that had been strained. Alexander felt as though he was seeing his family's history through a completely different lens. The fairy tale narrative of his parents' marriage and his mother's perfect reign was being replaced by something more complex and morally ambiguous. It was profoundly unsettling but also strangely liberating. Perfect people don't exist, and perhaps holding his mother to impossible standards had been unfair to everyone involved. Why didn't father tell us this? Sophia asked. Victoria's smile was sad and understanding. Because he loved you both too much to burden you with adult problems while you were still children, and because he loved Isabella too much to want her memory diminished by political complexities. The admission revealed something about Victoria that Alexander hadn't expected. She understood and respected his father's love for his first wife, even while struggling with the burden of competing with an idealized memory. Sergeant Thomas cleared his throat respectfully. Your Highnesses, perhaps these discussions would be more appropriate in a private family setting? The Queen Mother's chambers might not be the ideal location for such conversations. Alexander nodded, recognizing the wisdom in the suggestion. The room felt heavy with history and emotion, and continuing such delicate discussions there seemed almost disrespectful to his mother's memory. You're right, Thomas. Victoria, would you be willing to continue this conversation in the family dining room? We need to talk, really talk, about how we move forward as a family. Victoria looked surprised by the invitation, as if she hadn't expected reconciliation to be possible after the day's events. Are you certain? After everything that's happened today, I wouldn't blame you for wanting me to simply disappear. Heirs are so firmly given as parts as an untofferable dog. They are passing new meanings. And despite everything that's happened today, I wouldn't blame you for wanting me to simply disappear. We need to figure out how to make that work for everyone. As they prepared to leave Queen Isabella's chambers, Alexander took one last look around the room. The chaos from Victoria's earlier activities had been largely restored to order by the efficient guards, but the emotional upheaval of the day would take much longer to resolve. He carefully picked up his mother's wedding dress, intending to have it properly preserved and protected. As he lifted the delicate silk, a small piece of paper fluttered to the floor. Sophia bent to retrieve it, unfolding what appeared to be a handwritten note. "Alex," she said softly. "This is Mother's handwriting." Alexander set the dress down and took the note from his sister. In their mother's elegant script, he read words that seemed to speak directly to their current situation. "My dearest children, if you are reading this, then time has passed and you are dealing with complexities I hope to shield you from during my life. Remember that love takes many forms, and that your father's happiness must not be sacrificed to preserve my memory. The woman who comes after me will face impossible comparisons, and she will need your kindness more than your judgment. The kingdom's future matters more than the past's perfection. Choose forgiveness and growth over resentment and stagnation. All my love, Mother." The room fell completely silent as the implications of the note sank in. Queen Isabella, even in death, was offering wisdom that seemed tailor-made for their current crisis. Victoria read the note over Alexander's shoulder, fresh tears beginning to flow. She knew, she whispered. She knew how difficult this would be. "She always knew things," Sophia said softly. "She used to say that a good queen plans not just for her own reign, but for the transitions that come after." Alexander folded the note carefully, feeling as though his mother had reached across time to offer exactly the guidance they needed. The discovery reframed everything that had happened that day, not as a betrayal of her memory, but as an opportunity to honor her wisdom about forgiveness and moving forward. "Victoria," he said, turning to face his stepmother with new understanding, "I think Mother would want us to find a way to work together, not by erasing the past, but by building something positive for the future." Victoria nodded, unable to speak through her emotions. Captain Marcus stepped forward with a suggestion that surprised everyone. "Your Highnesses, perhaps Lady Victoria could establish her own wing of the castle? Somewhere she could create new traditions and showcase her own heritage without disturbing the preservation of Queen Isabella's legacy." It was a practical solution that addressed everyone's needs. Victoria could have space to be herself without constantly competing with the past, while Alexander and Sophia could maintain their mother's memory intact. "The East Wing has been unused for years," Sophia said thoughtfully. "It has beautiful rooms and could easily be renovated to reflect Victoria's taste and background." For the first time that day, Victoria's face showed genuine hope. "You would really consider that? After everything I've done?" "People make mistakes when they're desperate," Alexander said simply. "The question is what we do about it moving forward." As they finally prepared to leave Queen Isabella's chambers, Alexander felt as though they were closing one chapter of the family's story and beginning another. The wedding dress was safe, the immediate crisis was resolved, and perhaps most importantly, they had found a path forward that honored both the past and the future. The discovery of his mother's note seemed to bless their efforts at reconciliation, offering proof that love and wisdom could transcend even death to guide the living toward better choices. Part 5. 3 months had passed since the dramatic confrontation in Queen Isabella's chambers, and Valdoria Castle had undergone a transformation that seemed to reflect the royal family's new understanding of itself. The East Wing, once dusty and neglected, now hummed with activity as Victoria's renovation project neared completion. Prince Alexander stood in the corridor connecting the old section of the castle with Victoria's new domain, marveling at how thoughtfully she had approached the design. Rather than creating a stark contrast to the existing architecture, she had chosen to complement and enhance it, creating spaces that felt both fresh and respectfully integrated with the castle's history. Princess Sophia emerged from Victoria's new private office, carrying a stack of correspondence that suggested the extent of her stepmother's work on international relations. "She's been in negotiations with the Eastern Kingdoms for weeks now," Sophia reported to her brother. "The preliminary trade agreements look incredibly promising." The change in Sophia's attitude toward Victoria had been remarkable to witness. Once she understood the political pressures their stepmother faced and saw evidence of her genuine skills in diplomacy, Sophia had become one of Victoria's strongest supporters. The two women had discovered a shared passion for international policy that had formed the foundation of an unexpected friendship. "And the cultural exchange program?" Alexander asked. "Beyond successful," Sophia replied with enthusiasm. "Victoria's connections have brought artists and scholars from kingdoms we'd barely had contact with during Mother's reign. The throne room gallery now showcases works from 12 different cultures." The cultural exchange program had been Victoria's first major initiative after establishing her own space in the castle. Rather than trying to replace Queen Isabella's humanitarian focus, Victoria had found ways to extend and complement it through cultural diplomacy. The approach had proven both politically effective and genuinely enriching for the kingdom's citizens. They walked together toward the main courtyard, where preparations were underway for the day's most significant event, the formal presentation of Queen Isabella's preserved belongings to the kingdom's new royal museum. The wedding dress, along with other artifacts from previous royal generations, would be displayed in a specially designed wing where citizens could view their heritage. "Father seems more relaxed than he's been in years," Sophia observed as they spotted King Edmund supervising the installation of display cases. Alexander nodded in agreement. The resolution of the conflict between his children and his new wife had lifted a burden from the king's shoulders that none of them had fully appreciated. For 2 years, he had been trying to balance competing loyalties and expectations while managing his own grief and political responsibilities. "Your Highnesses," Captain Marcus approached with his characteristic efficiency, "the museum curator is ready for your final approval of the display arrangements." They followed him to the new museum wing, where Queen Isabella's belongings had been arranged with tasteful reverence. The wedding dress occupied the centerpiece position, displayed on a specially designed mannequin that showcased the gown's elegant lines while protecting it from light and moisture. Surrounding exhibits told the story of her reign through personal artifacts, official documents, and photographs that captured both her public responsibilities and private moments. Victoria was already in the museum, making final adjustments to a display about international relations during Isabella's reign. She had insisted on including honest assessments of both the successes and challenges of that period, creating an exhibit that was more historically accurate and ultimately more respectful than idealized versions would have been. "The Eastern Kingdom's delegation arrives tomorrow for the opening ceremony," Victoria reported. "They're particularly interested in the trade policy comparisons between Isabella's approach and our current negotiations." The upcoming ceremony represented more than just a museum opening. It was a symbol of the royal family's ability to honor the past while embracing the future. International delegations would see both Queen Isabella's legacy and Victoria's contributions, understanding that the kingdom's strength came from continuity rather than radical change. "Victoria," Alexander said, "I want you to know how grateful we are for everything you've done these past months. The way you've handled the political challenges while respecting Mother's memory, it's been remarkable." Victoria's smile was warm but tinged with the humility that had replaced her earlier arrogance. "I should be thanking you and Sophia for giving me the chance to prove I could do better. After that day in your mother's chambers, I wasn't sure reconciliation would be possible." "Mother's note made it possible," Sophia said simply. "Her wisdom about choosing forgiveness over resentment. It changed everything." They were interrupted by the arrival of King Edmund, who had been reviewing security arrangements for the next day's ceremony. His face showed the contentment of a man who had successfully navigated an extremely difficult period in his family's history. "The final guest list confirms representatives from 15 kingdoms," he announced. "Victoria's diplomatic outreach has generated more international interest than we've seen in years." The success of Victoria's diplomatic initiatives had validated her earlier claims about the importance of international relations. Rather than dismantling Isabella's humanitarian policies, Victoria had found ways to strengthen them through better alliance building and cultural exchange. "Father," Alexander said, "we need to discuss the succession planning documents. With the kingdom's international profile rising again, we should formalize the policies that will guide future transitions." King Edmund nodded approvingly. The request demonstrated that his children were thinking beyond immediate challenges to long-term stability, exactly the kind of strategic thinking required for effective leadership. We should also establish formal protocols for integrating future spouses into the royal family, Sophia added. What we learned from our mistakes with Victoria could help prevent similar problems in the future. Victoria looked touched by Sophia's reference to our mistakes, rather than placing all the blame on her. The shared responsibility for the earlier conflicts had been crucial to their eventual resolution. As they completed their tour of the museum, Alexander reflected on how dramatically their family dynamic had evolved. The crisis that had begun with Victoria threatening to destroy his mother's wedding dress had ultimately led to a stronger, more honest relationship between all of them. The wedding dress itself, now safely displayed behind protective glass, seemed to embody the transformation. Rather than being a source of conflict between past and present, it had become a bridge connecting Queen Isabella's legacy with Victoria's contributions. Visitors would see both women's achievements, understanding that royal service took different forms in different eras. The opening ceremony tomorrow will mark a new chapter for our kingdom, King Edmund said with satisfaction. We've learned to honor our history while embracing our future. As evening fell over Valdoria Castle, the royal family gathered in Victoria's new dining room for a private dinner before the next day's public events. The room reflected Victoria's aesthetic preferences while maintaining the warmth and elegance that characterized the rest of the castle. Over dinner, they discussed plans for future initiatives that would combine Isabella's humanitarian focus with Victoria's diplomatic skills. The conversation was animated but respectful, with everyone contributing ideas and building on each other's suggestions. To Queen Isabella's memory and Queen Victoria's future, King Edmund raised his glass in a toast that perfectly captured their family's new understanding. To family, Alexander added, in all its complicated, imperfect, wonderful forms. As they drank the toast, sunlight from the tall windows caught the crystal glasses, creating small rainbows that danced across the table. A perfect metaphor for how individual elements could combine to create something beautiful and unexpected. The wedding dress, secure in its new home, had become more than just a preserved artifact. It was a symbol of love's endurance, family's resilience, and the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds through understanding and forgiveness. Outside the castle walls, the kingdom prepared to celebrate not just its history, but its future. A future built on the foundation of honoring the past while embracing the change that would inevitably come. The royal family had learned that true strength lay not in perfection, but in the ability to grow, forgive, and find new ways to serve their people's needs. The story that had begun with conflict and threatened destruction had become, instead, a tale of redemption, understanding, and the triumph of love over pride. Queen Isabella's wisdom, preserved in her final note, had guided them toward a resolution that honored everyone involved while pointing the way toward a brighter future. In the end, the wedding dress had been saved not just as a beautiful artifact, but as a symbol of everything the royal family had learned about love, loss, forgiveness, and the complex beauty of human relationships.